Today we're taking some junk rear axle parts off of my old rusty 97 Firebird with intent to save the discs for my 8.5 10 bolt rear that's going in my G-body Cutlass over there. Now you're probably wondering, why am I putting discs on an 8.5 in my Cutlass? Well, currently it has a 7.5 inch 10 bolt. It does have a posi with 342s. The problem is it has 26 spline axles, and it has a Grand National 4.1 liter, so slightly bigger bore than factory, Buick V6. Not that I'm planning to take the car to the drag strip all the time, but I do want disc brakes and a rear that's not going to blow up with light 60 foot, 1.7 to or so 60 foot time. So really the goal here is take what's useful off of this Firebird rear axle, put on my 8.5, which is also a little bit of a hack setup, and get the last usable bits off this axle. I parted the car out, or took the engine out, put it in 99, as you can probably see in some other YouTube videos in the channel somewhere. But this came out of the old car. I was going to try to sell it because it is a posi 342. The problem is no one really wants it. It did spend a lot of time in Minnesota, mostly North Dakota, but a lot of Minnesota, so it is crusty. And it's got 190 some thousand miles on, so I thought I'd be able to get $300-400 for it. That was 10 years ago, when there was enough 4th gen still on the road. So nobody wanted it, so I'm cutting it up for scrap. Anyways, LT1 brakes on a G-body. Let's go. So I think what I've decided is the plan here is the flange needs to be 52.5 to match the stock G-body width. If I cut back 2.625 inches and add 1 inch from here to here on both sides, that would get 52.5 from the flange to flange when welded on here. Basically, 1.625 inches on both sides from here to here needs to be cut off. My plan is to cut an additional 1 inch on each side, and then I have a 1 inch area that I can bevel on both the main ZR2 8.5 and the 7.5 car outside stub. What I haven't quite decided yet is if I want to butt weld it, or if I want to cut this flush and actually cut maybe another inch off of here and then turn that diameter down right where my tape measure is on the lathe here. And then that will be a slight press fit or a slip fit into here. It really depends on what the ID of this tube is and what the OD of that tube is versus the ID, and see if I can turn that down. The nice thing is if I cut that flush or an extra inch long, I'll have a nice square edge from which to butt up against, and then it'll keep it from getting any out of parallel or perpendicularity. So I think that's the plan to move forward. And now that I got the brakes pulled off both, you can see the issue with the axle diameter a little bit more clearly. So the axle tube where the wheel bearing sits on a car is 2.5. The axle tube on a S10 truck style is 2 3/4. And if you actually mic out the axles, that's a 28 spline 4th gen, and that's a truck ZR2 S10. the bearing diameter is 1.4 inches on the 28 spline, and on the 30 spline truck axle it's 1.62. So you're not able to just put car axles in a truck rear end stub wheel bearing size. The Mosier axles I have are the 1.4 inch diameter, the 30 splines that are custom, so off the shelf but aftermarket. So they use the car outer, but like the truck 30 spline inner. So really what you got to do is take, like I said, the outside like 2-inch piece and stick it on the S10 8.5. Got the old portaband off the stand where it usually sits, and I whacked both the ends off the Firebird and the S10 8.5. So I had to cut 1 5/8 inches off of the tube on both sides, basically where the flange sits. The axle had to get 3¼ inches narrower. And what my original plan is, well, there was 3 options. One was that I was gonna butt weld the axle flange to the tube. 2, I was just gonna turn off the tube here and basically mate the flange right up to the edge here and weld this to the tube directly. And then option 3, I was going to mow the OD of this tube off and try to do a slip fit into here with about 1 inch in overlap. This tube, I could have cut 1 5/8 or 2 5/8 off. I cut 1 5/8. To do option 1 where they're butt welded, I would have needed to cut 2 5/8 off and then cut 1 inch from the flange to here, and then I would just butt weld those, and that would get me the total of 1 5/8 cut down on each side. The problem is, like I said, I wanted to sleeve this or make it kind of a slip fit. The problem is, it might be a little bit hard to tell here, but the ODs of both axles are essentially the same. So there's not enough meat to turn this down. And then the truck tube, I don't know if this is just an 8.5 thing in general or if it's just because it's a truck 8.5 S10 rear, but the axle tube is a lot thicker on the ZR2 S10 versus the car. So even if the tubes were the same, this only would have worked if the tubes are the same diameter. I guess if I had like a boring machine, I could put the whole axle on and then I could OD cut it, but that's just not realistic for what I'm doing. So I'm just gonna chuck this in the lathe. I'm gonna cut from here to here 1 inch, and I'm gonna put a nice bevel on it, and I'm gonna go recut that tube another inch back, and then use a grinder, butt weld that up, and then use some fixturing tooling that I have, and then just align everything and butt weld it, because I think that's the most straightforward option here. Well, would you look at that? I dropped the axles in. I put on the ends along with the LT1 brake, rotors, calipers, and caliper bracket. I ended up, like I say, going with cutting 2 5/8 off the axle from the flange on the S10, and then I left 1 inch on from the flange to the face on the ends, and I stuck them in the lathe to make sure that is nice and perpendicular or parallel to both. And got a little gap there. I'm actually gonna drop the whole rear in the car to make sure that my clocking of the caliper is correct, and then once I get that done, I will make sure, mark a line here to here, because that caliper might hit the frame if it's too high. And then I'll weld that. I am really nicely centered. It's a little off just by the image here, but it does actually match up pretty darn good. So my measurements were pretty accurate, so I'm pretty happy with it. And once I can get that in the car and test fit, do some super hot glue gunning, and then I'll have rear end ready for the car. Nice. And a couple days later, the 7.5 rear is taken out of my Cutlass, and I have the 8.5 with the discs in. So the thing I'm doing here is making sure that the caliper is at the right clock rotation. So on my 2+2, I had a set of disc brakes from a 4-wheel drive Blazer S10. The 4-wheel drive Blazer S10 mounts the caliper on the front of the wheel. The 2-wheel drive Blazer mounts it on the back of the wheel. I just took the 2-wheel drive backing plates out of production, and second gen F-body people bought them all up because you need one of the sides to do the disc brake conversion on a second gen F-body. So here, since both calipers need to go in the back, on my 2+2, I just put the Blazer calipers in the back by flipping the backing plates side to side. Here, since I'm using the LT1 era F-body stuff, the caliper sits really low in the back. It sits at probably about 430. But on a G-body, you don't need to hang it as low. You can actually pull it up. The problem I had with the Blazer calipers on my 2+2 is they were actually too high, and the caliper hit the frame right there. So what I'm doing here is making sure the caliper is high enough that it doesn't hit the ground, but it's not too high that I have to cut the frame. And normally, if you're doing LT1 discs on your G-body, you're just gonna drill the 8.5 or whatever rear, 7.5 you're using. You're gonna reuse the existing axle flange and drill 2 new holes in the top. The problem on this setup, since I have this new backing plate from the F-body, or the backing plate bracket, I suppose, I can put the caliper anywhere I want. One of the things a lot of people have issues with on LT calipers is the bracket right down here to hold the shock. As you can see, the e-brake bracket basically runs into the lower control arm tab where the shock mounts. So you can kind of see you're basically never going to get the shock in there because it's hitting. So most people end up relocating the shock mount over and down a little bit. It's not going to need to be moved as far on my setup because I have the caliper rotated up. It's kind of hard to see down here, but the bottom of the backing plate with caliper bolts to is basically horizontal or parallel to the ground. And then the tab that's welded on the axle, it's hard to see, is up at about 15 degrees. So I've basically pulled the caliper up, rotated it counterclockwise about 15 degrees. But the rear is in. It does fit just like an 8.5 Grand National or 442 rear would fit. I do need to do a little tweaks. I'm going to weld a little bit extra material on my lower ear because I need to get the control arm pointing horizontal at ride height or even upwards a little bit. Otherwise, I'm going to have bad geometry. So I'm going to weld probably 1.5 inches, 2 inches in the bottom here and drill a new hole, maybe 2 inches lower than that hole. But overall, I'm decently happy. I think where it is where it needs to be. I have just enough room. You can see I got about 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch between the frame and the caliper here. and I got about an inch on the bottom. So setting the height of the rear was a little bit of a struggle. Since the G-body bump stop typically is going to bottom out on the frame right here, I don't have that bump stop location on the S10 8.5. I'm gonna have to weld something in, but I'm basically leaving about an inch and a half between the top of the axle and the bottom of the frame. So overall, I think I'm gonna mark it with paint pen and do the other side, drop the axle out, and then burn it on. And I gotta put studs in, axle shaft seals, give it a good paint, redo the brake hoses or brake lines, get some new hoses, but yeah, pretty happy. Got the rear end welded up for the cutlass. So as I cut the disc brake flanges with the car size bearing off the 4th gen Firebird rear, I welded them on to the S10 8.5. I already had this rear end jigged up for a G-body when it was S10 ZR2 width, and the lower control arm brackets were already on, and I already had the upper control arm bracket plate there along with the spring perches. Besides cutting the ends off and then welding the new ones on, I also clocked them. You can see they're tilted forward a little bit versus being, instead of this being parallel to the back of the housing, it's kilted forward. And that's because the the caliper kind of mounts right where the shock mounts. So when I tilted it up, the shock clears the lower control arm bracket. I welded this little ear on for the shock. And then because I welded that shock on, that hole won't be used anymore, but I'm just gonna keep it there. What I also did is I had bought some 3x4 inch tubing and cut it down for some lower control arm extension brackets. This was from a eBay, like $40 or something like that, 9-inch kit. So you could put a 9-inch in an A body or a G body. That only had the one hole down here, which is in like a stock G body position. Just to get my instant center right. And since it was out and I had my welder, I took that square tubing or the rectangle tubing, cut a C channel out of it, and then I did have to take a 1/4 inch out of the inside since this tube isn't really perfectly dimensional to 3x4 or 3x3 C channel. It's like 2 3/4 by 3. So I just took a 1/4 inch out and welded it. Then I welded the extra 1 1/4 or 1 3/8 onto the bottom here. And then I went 1 1/4 down. So I got 1 1/4 lowered and 2.5 inch lower holes. So overall, what I used to narrow it is I built these spacers or these bushings on my lathe. And you can buy stuff like this, but I had all the material, so I just built it. And that inserts here, and then it's got a 1-inch hole in the inside. And then I got these bushings on the outside that slip in. I just got rags stuffed in so I don't get dirt on my bushing. That just slides in as the axle diameter. So that's the same diameter there. And this is the diameter of the bearing race. So I got those 4 parts and I just put a tube and 1-inch cold rolled piece of steel in that's straight to make sure that this and the center and the other side are all collinear. So I got this, I'm gonna bring outside, wire wheel it, and get some paint on it. I also need to build some brake lines for it, but I'm gonna do that after I get it painted. So looking pretty good. Almost ready to put in here. I got my old 204R out that slips. I bought a converter, and I got my nice shiny new 200 down there. And it's gonna go in here, and then hopefully I won't have slippy transmission issues, and it'll actually make a 1-2 shift under boost. So more action coming up soon. On today's episode of why does my Mosier 30 spline axle with a disc brake hit the caliper? Well, I had twisted the spline in the Grand Prix, but I figured V6 turbo auto, that axle will be fine for the Cutlass as long as it's not behind a stick blower V8 car. So I set up my dial indicator and got the center on the drill there, and then I got the spline in the chuck. And there's like well over 20 thou. It's actually maxing the indicator out. There's like over 20 thou of banana, so she shot. We're done. Well, after playing musical axles, because that one is actually banana bent, I thought it was just a slight tweak in the spline, but the whole thing is like 50 thou bent. I had to order a whole new set of axles. I'm gonna keep one spare for this car and the Grand Prix because they're on the same axles, but here we are. So we got the 2-door Blazer bar as the sway bar. I had that on the Grand Prix before. Just had too much power and it was torquing over on the launch. It's better than the factory one that mounts on the control arms, but it's not quite as good as like an aftermarket one. But for this car, it should be fine. I got the F-body discs on. I got my clips. I got my ZR or ZQ8 S10 front bump stops here. They're foam instead of like hard rubber, so if you hit a bump, you don't feel the harshness. It's more of a soft spring rate. I got the silicone sealant and the ring gear cap on, or the ring gear cover. Got the bushings pressed in the top. I got all the lower control arm bushings changed out. They're factory boxed arms in the lower, and I just put poly bushings in them. So got the brake lines all run, so I think we're good to go. We can get the car back on the ground, get the control arms, springs, and shocks in, and we should be good to go. The one thing for the brakes I bought some new Nycop line, and then I just drilled and tapped a hole right here, and then I used one of the factory bolts to mount the hose. So it should all mount up pretty nicely in the car, and it was supposed to be for almost free. I guess I had to buy seals, axles, brake lines, and bump stops, but everything else was there. I probably only had about $50 in the line and the new hose and the seals. What really killed me was the new axles. I guess I had $50 roughly and some ARP studs, but overall should be good to go in there and help out with the new power and transmission that actually shifts under full boost.